"Sell me the 70-year-old virgin." The most feared mountain man shouted at auction. Dust swirls in the street. A church bell tolls noon. On the wooden platform, a trembling 70-year-old woman is mocked as useless, her dignity stripped before the jeering crowd. Then, thunder. A giant mountain man steps forward, scars on his face, eyes blazing. His voice shakes the ground. "Sell me the 70-year-old virgin!" The town gasps. Why would the most feared man on the frontier claim her? But when he drapes his coat across her shoulders instead of dragging her away, whispers ripple. Is this protection or something more? Behind the laughter and the rumors lies a secret. A hidden deed, a spring worth more than gold, and men willing to burn, chain, and kill to seize it. Now, an unlikely pair stand against power, shame, and the violence of a lawless land. But mercy and faith may be their only weapons. The question is, can a forgotten widow and the most feared mountain man hold back a town, a syndicate, and their own broken pasts? Or will everything be swallowed by fire? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Hannah McBride clutched the rough platform railing, her weathered fingers trembling against the splintered wood. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the livery yard, where the stench of horse manure mingled with the dust and desperation. Around her, the faces of Silver Bluff's townsfolk blurred into a sea of sneers and judgment. "Next up," the auctioneer's voice cracked like a whip, "we got ourselves a real bargain." Hannah McBride, 70 years young. He grabbed her arm, making her stumble forward. "Might not be much use for heavy work, but she can still hold a broom, most days." Cruel laughter rippled through the crowd. Hannah's cheeks burned with shame. Her threadbare shawl, once a cherished gift from her mother, now seemed to mock her poverty. 20 years of teaching children their letters, 3 decades of keeping house for others, and here she stood, another disposable soul on the auction block. "Who'll start the bidding?" "Anyone?" The auctioneer's voice dripped with disdain. "Come now, surely someone needs their floors swept." More laughter. Hannah closed her eyes, remembering the day the bank had seized her tiny home. No savings left, no family to turn to, just the clothes on her back and the few possessions she could carry. "Look at her, she's barely standing," someone shouted. "Probably won't last the winter. Might as well auction off a scarecrow." Another voice joined in. The jeers grew louder, but suddenly a disturbance in the crowd caught Hannah's attention. People were stepping back, creating a path for someone pushing through. The laughter died in their throats. Kevin Brandt's massive frame emerged from the parting crowd. Hannah had seen him before, usually keeping to the shadows of the saloon or stalking through town like a wounded bear. His scarred face and reputation for violence made mothers hurry their children inside when he passed. Now he stood before the platform, his presence commanding silence. The sun cast harsh shadows across the deep scar that ran from his left temple to jaw. His eyes, hard as gunmetal, fixed on Hannah for a long moment before turning to the auctioneer. "Sell me the 70-year-old virgin!" His voice boomed across the yard, making several people flinch. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Hannah's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd heard whispered stories about Brandt, how he'd beaten 3 men senseless in a dispute over water rights, how he lived alone in the high country surrounded by weapons and animal pelts. The auctioneer cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Brandt, sir, starting bid is $2. $2 it is." Brandt's words fell like stones in a deep well. Nobody dared counter his bid. The auctioneer's gavel struck wood with unusual gentleness. "Sold, to Mr. Brandt." Hannah felt her knees weaken. What fate awaited her with this man? Would death have been kinder? But then Brandt did something unexpected. He shrugged off his buffalo hide coat, the leather worn smooth by years of use, and climbed the few steps to the platform. Hannah couldn't help but notice how the wooden boards creaked under his weight. Without a word, he draped the massive coat over her shoulders. The warmth of it enveloped her immediately, carrying the sense of wood smoke and pine. The coat was heavy, like armor, and reached almost to her ankles. Whispers rustled through the crowd. Hannah saw confusion replace the earlier mockery on their faces. The women who had turned away in embarrassment now watched with undisguised curiosity. "Come." Brant's voice was quieter now, meant for her ears alone. He offered his arm, not touching her, but waiting for her to accept his help down the platform steps. Hannah hesitated only a moment before placing her thin hand on his forearm. His muscles felt like iron beneath his shirt sleeve, but he moved with surprising gentleness as he guided her down. The crowd parted again as Brant led her away from the auction block. Hannah kept her eyes forward, but she could feel the stares boring into her back. The buffalo coat sheltered her not just from the afternoon chill, but from their prying eyes as well. They walked in silence past the general store, where old Mr. Peterson stood frozen with a crate of supplies in his arms. Past the milliner's shop, where Mrs. Thompson and her sewing circle pressed against the window glass. Past the telegraph office, where young Jimmy dropped his stack of messages. Only when they reached the edge of town did Hannah find her voice. "Mr. Brant," she said softly, "I don't understand." He stopped walking but didn't look at her. "No need to understand. You needed help, that's all. But why would you—" "I've seen enough good people ground down by this town." His jaw tightened. "Seen enough cruelty dressed up as business." Hannah pulled his coat tighter around herself, overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness from the man everyone feared. They say you're dangerous." A shadow of something, pain, regret, crossed his face. "They ain't wrong." He started walking again, slower now. "But dangerous don't always mean evil, just like proper don't always mean good. Those fine folks back there," he gestured toward town with a sharp motion, "they'd have watched you die in the street and called it the Lord's will." Hannah felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I can work," she said with quiet dignity. "I may be old, but I can cook and clean. I taught school for 20 years before." "You ain't got to prove nothing to me, Mrs. McBride." He stopped at a hitching post where a large bay horse waited. "Question is, you willing to trust the town monster long enough to get somewhere safe?" Hannah looked back at Silver Bluff, at the town that had been her home for 40 years. She saw faces still watching from windows and doorways, probably waiting to see if Kevin Brant would reveal some cruel intention. But the man beside her, this scarred giant who'd silenced a jeering crowd with 3 words, had shown her more kindness in 10 minutes than she'd received in years of proper society. "Yes," she said firmly. "I believe I am." For the first time, something close to a smile touched Brant's lips. He helped her mount the horse, making sure she was secure before taking the reins to lead them away from town. As they disappeared into the golden afternoon light, Hannah sat straight in the saddle, wrapped in a buffalo hide coat that smelled of pine and wood smoke. Behind her, whispers and speculation filled Silver Bluff's streets. But ahead lay something she hadn't felt in years, a glimmer of hope, protected by the most unlikely guardian angel anyone could imagine. The crowd that had gathered to mock her misfortune stood watching until horse and riders vanished from sight. In their silence lay the weight of shame, the recognition that true Christianity had come not from their church-going hearts, but from the rough hands of a man they'd feared and shunned. And Hannah McBride, 70 years old and alone in the world, felt the first stirrings of something she thought she'd lost forever. Dignity, restored by $2 and a buffalo coat, given freely by a man who understood what it meant to stand alone against the world's cruelty. Kevin Brant's calloused hands were surprisingly gentle as he helped Hannah down from the auction platform. His touch was light, barely there, as if he feared his strength might shatter her like fine china. The wooden steps creaked under their combined weight, and Hannah steadied herself against his solid arm. The crowd that had gathered for the widow sale drew back, creating a wide circle around them. Their earlier mockery had transformed into wary whispers and suspicious glances. Some townsfolk openly scoffed at the sight of the massive mountain man leading the frail widow, while others watched with puzzled expressions, trying to make sense of his unexpected show of mercy. "Did you see that? Brant actually paid good money for her," someone muttered. "Reckon he's gone soft in the head," another voice answered. "Or maybe he's got darker purposes in mind," a woman whispered, crossing herself. Hannah heard it all, each comment striking like a small stone against her dignity, but the buffalo coat around her shoulders was heavy and warm, forming a barrier between her and their cruel words. She focused on putting one foot in front of the other as Kevin led her down Silver Bluff's main street. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty road. They passed the general store, where Mr. Peterson usually greeted her with a kind word. Today he just stared, a sack of flour forgotten in his arms. The dressmaker's shop windows were filled with faces, women pressing close to the glass to watch their strange procession. When they reached the hitching post where Kevin's wagon waited, Hannah finally found her voice. It came out barely above a whisper, trembling with fear and uncertainty. "Mr. Brant, why would someone like you want someone like me?" Kevin secured his coat more firmly around her shoulders before answering. His voice was low and rough, like rocks tumbling down a mountainside. "No woman ought to be treated like cattle. Not in my presence, not while I draw breath." The simple declaration held such conviction that Hannah felt something loosen in her chest. She studied his profile as he helped her up onto the wagon seat. His face was a map of survival, a deep scar running from temple to jaw, nose broken at least once, lines etched deep around his eyes from squinting into mountain winds. But his hands remained gentle as he made sure she was settled. The wagon lurched forward, wooden wheels clattering over the rutted street. Kevin handled the reins with quiet competence, guiding his team of mules at an easy pace that wouldn't jostle his passenger too much. Hannah gripped the seat's edge, still uncertain of her fate, but drawing comfort from his considerate actions. They passed the last buildings of Silver Bluff in silence. Hannah watched the town shrink behind them, the place she'd called home for 4 decades growing smaller until it was just a collection of sun-bleached buildings against the vast Colorado landscape. The familiar sight of Widow's Peak rose behind it, the mountain that had witnessed her joy as a young teacher, her grief when her fiancé never returned from war, and now her exile as a destitute old woman. The afternoon wore on as they followed the creek road. Kevin remained silent, his presence beside her like a great boulder, immovable, somehow both threatening and reassuring. Hannah found herself studying him when she thought he wouldn't notice. His massive shoulders were hunched slightly, as if he carried an invisible weight. His hands, scarred and rough as tree bark, held the reins with surprising delicacy. The sun was setting when Kevin finally pulled the wagon off the road, choosing a spot near where the creek widened and slowed. The water burbled over rocks, a peaceful sound that reminded Hannah of better days. He helped her down from the wagon with the same careful attention he'd shown in town. "Need to rest the mules," he said, his first words in hours. "And you need to eat." Hannah stood uncertain, clutching his buffalo coat around her shoulders while Kevin efficiently made camp. He moved with the ease of long practice, gathering wood and starting a fire as the darkness gathered. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face, making his scars seem deeper. From his wagon, he produced a battered tin pot and a bag of beans. Hannah watched as he measured the beans carefully, added water from his canteen, and set the pot near the flames. His movements were precise, economical, like a man used to doing everything alone. The crickets began their evening chorus as the last light faded from the sky. Hannah perched on a fallen log, pulling her thin shawl tighter beneath the buffalo coat. She jumped slightly when Kevin spoke again. You're wondering if you made a mistake, trusting me? It wasn't a question. Hannah clasped her hands in her lap. I'm wondering why a man like you would show kindness to an old woman like me. Kevin stirred the beans slowly. Maybe I've seen too many good folks ground down by people who call themselves Christian. His voice held an edge of bitterness. Maybe I'm tired of watching it happen. While the beans cooked, Kevin busied himself making up a bedroll near the fire. Hannah watched in surprise as he gathered extra blankets from his wagon, creating a comfortable nest that would keep her warm through the mountain night. He placed it close enough to the flames for warmth, but not so near as to be dangerous. When the beans were ready, he filled a tin cup for her first, then served himself. They ate in silence, accompanied by the creek's gentle music and the pop of burning wood. Hannah couldn't remember the last time someone had served her first at a meal. After cleaning the dishes in the creek, Kevin arranged his own bedroll on the other side of the fire, maintaining a respectful distance that spoke volumes about his intentions. Before lying down, he turned to her one last time. You'll be safe, he said simply. The firelight caught his eyes, and Hannah saw something there that the townsfolk of Silver Bluff had probably never noticed. Not violence or cruelty, but a deep, abiding weariness. No harm will come to you while you're in my care. Hannah settled into her blankets, surprised by how comfortable they were. The fire crackled softly, its warmth reaching out like gentle hands. Across the flames, she could see Kevin's massive form, turned away from her, giving her privacy even in their shared camp. The creek continued its eternal conversation with the stones. Crickets chirped their evening prayers. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and wild sage. Hannah lay awake for a while, marveling at how the day had transformed from one of humiliation to something entirely unexpected. She had been prepared for cruelty, for demands, for the worst of what men could do. Instead, she had found protection in the most unlikely form. A scarred mountain man who treated her with more dignity than all the fine folks of Silver Bluff combined. As sleep began to claim her, Hannah realized that for the first time in years, she felt truly safe. The man the town feared as a monster had shown himself to be something else entirely. A guardian angel in a buffalo hide coat, whose rough hands knew how to be gentle and whose silence spoke of deeper wounds than any visible scar. The fire burned low, its light touching both sleeping forms with equal grace, the massive, battle-scarred mountain man and the fragile widow he had saved from degradation. Above them, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, witnessing this strange new beginning born from an act of unexpected mercy. Dawn painted the eastern sky in soft pinks and golds as Kevin began loading the wagon. Hannah watched from her seat on the fallen log, clutching a tin cup of coffee he'd pressed into her hands. The morning air held a bite that made her grateful for his buffalo coat, still draped around her shoulders. Kevin worked methodically, his movements precise despite his massive size. He secured their bedrolls, checked the wagon wheels, and adjusted the harnesses on the mules with practiced efficiency. Not a motion was wasted, like a man who'd learned to conserve his energy through years of solitary living. When everything was ready, Hannah expected him to climb up beside her on the wagon seat. Instead, he handed her the reins and said quietly, "Mules know the trail. I'll walk alongside." "But surely that's not necessary," Hannah protested, looking at the rough terrain ahead. "There's room enough here." Kevin shook his head. "Been walking these mountains most of my life. Prefer it that way." His tone held no room for argument, though it remained gentle. As they set out, Hannah marveled at his stamina. Hour after hour, he maintained a steady pace beside the wagon, his long legs eating up the miles. The sun climbed higher, but Kevin showed no sign of tiring. Sometimes he would gesture for her to stop while he checked the trail ahead or moved fallen branches from their path. The countryside grew wilder as they traveled north, the gentle creek valleys giving way to steeper terrain. Pines grew thicker here, their scent sharp and clean in the mountain air. Hannah found herself studying Kevin's profile when he walked near her side of the wagon. In the clear morning light, his scars seemed less fearsome, more like badges of survival. By late afternoon, her bones aching from the wagon's constant motion, Hannah noticed Kevin's pace quickening slightly. He pointed ahead to where the trail curved around a steep ridge. "Almost there," he said, the first words he'd spoken in hours. They crested the ridge, and Hannah caught her breath. Below them lay a small valley, sheltered by towering pines. A log cabin stood nestled against the tree line, rough-hewn but solid, with a stone chimney reaching toward the sky. Nearby stood a well-built smokehouse, its walls darkened by years of use. A corral stretched behind the buildings, empty except for 2 pack mules that raised their heads at their approach. Kevin helped her down from the wagon with the same gentle care he'd shown the day before. Hannah's legs trembled from sitting so long, and she gripped his arm for support. His muscles felt like iron beneath her fingers. "Need to show you inside," he said, leading her towards the cabin. "Before it gets dark." The door creaked open to reveal a single room, larger than Hannah had expected. A massive stone hearth dominated one wall, cold now but clearly well used. A sturdy table and chair occupied the center of the room, worn smooth by years of use. Against the far wall stood a solid bunk with a straw-filled mattress, covered with wool blankets. Shelves lined the walls, holding an assortment of dried meat, tools, and supplies. Everything had its place, speaking of a man who valued order even in his solitude. The floor was swept clean, and a window let in the late afternoon light. Hannah stood just inside the doorway, suddenly feeling like an intruder in this carefully ordered space. This was a man's home, arranged for one person's needs. What place could there be for a useless old woman? Kevin seemed to sense her discomfort. "Bunk's yours," he said firmly. "I've got a cot I use when hunting. It'll do fine in that corner." He pointed to a space near the hearth. "I couldn't possibly take your bed," Hannah protested, but Kevin was already moving her small bundle of belongings toward the bunk. "Won't hear otherwise," he said. "My mom'd rise from her grave and tan my hide if I let a woman sleep on a cot while I took the bed." The mention of his mother surprised Hannah. It was the first personal detail he'd offered about himself. As darkness approached, Kevin built a fire in the hearth and prepared a simple supper of cornbread and venison. The meat was tender, well-preserved, showing his skill at providing for himself. They ate in silence until Hannah could no longer contain her curiosity. "Why do you live alone up here?" she asked softly, then quickly added, "If you don't mind my asking?" Kevin stared into his plate for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with memory. "War leaves marks that ain't just on the skin. Learned I don't trust men much anymore. Up here, at least, I know where I stand." He touched the scar that ran down his face, a gesture that seemed unconscious. People in towns, they see these marks and make up their own stories. Easier to live where the only judgment comes from the mountains. Hannah nodded, understanding more than he might guess. Gathering her courage, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have scars too, though not the kind you can see." Kevin looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the table. "I was never wed," she continued, the words coming faster now, like a confession long held back. "My intended was a preacher, a good man who believed in serving others. He went to minister to the wounded during the war." She swallowed hard. "Never came back." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Hannah's hands trembled as she folded them in her lap. "The town never let me forget it. Virgin spinster, they called me, like it was something shameful. 40 years I taught their children, nursed their sick, helped where I could. But that label followed me like a shadow." Kevin's massive hands were still on the table, his food forgotten. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "That don't make you less." 3 simple words, but they hit Hannah like a physical force. Tears sprang to her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away with a corner of her shawl. "People who judge you for keeping faith with a dead man," Kevin continued, "ain't worth the breath they use for talking." Hannah stared at him, this feared mountain man who spoke with such unexpected wisdom. In the firelight, his scars seemed to soften, and she saw something in his eyes that might have been understanding. "Thank you," she whispered, and they both knew she meant more than just the words or the meal or the bed. Kevin nodded once, then rose to clear the plates. His movements were deliberate, giving her time to compose herself. When he spoke again, his voice was back to its usual quiet tone. "Sun sets early in these mountains. Best we get some rest." He showed her where he kept clean water for washing, then busied himself setting up his cot while she prepared for bed. The bunk was surprisingly comfortable, the blankets warm and clean-smelling. From her pillow, Hannah could see Kevin's broad back as he banked the fire for the night. The cabin creaked softly as it cooled, a sound that would become familiar in the days ahead. Outside, a gentle wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Hannah lay awake for a while, marveling at how much her life had changed in just 2 days. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was that perhaps God hadn't abandoned her after all. Perhaps he'd just been waiting for the right moment to send an unlikely angel, one who wore a buffalo hide coat and carried scars both visible and hidden. Hannah woke to the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood. The sound carried clearly through the cabin's thick logs, steady as a heartbeat. Pale dawn light filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the swept floor. She lay still for a moment, letting her old bones adjust to the morning chill. Rising carefully, she wrapped Kevin's mother's shawl around her shoulders. The wool still held a faint scent of cedar, speaking of careful storage. Hannah made her way to the hearth, where embers glowed beneath their ash blanket. She added kindling just as Kevin had shown her the night before, coaxing the fire back to life. The warmth drew her closer, and without thinking, she began to hum. It was an old hymn her mother had taught her, Amazing Grace, the notes rising soft and clear in the quiet cabin. The familiar melody brought comfort, memories of Sunday mornings, and her mother's hands smoothing her dress before church. The chopping outside stopped. Through the window, Hannah could see Kevin standing motionless, axe half raised. Something flickered across his face, a memory perhaps, or a ghost of one. He remained still for several heartbeats before returning to his work, though his rhythm seemed less certain now. Hannah busied herself preparing a simple breakfast from their stores. When Kevin came in, bringing with him the sharp scent of split pine, she had cornmeal mush warming on the hearth and dried apples soaking in water. "Sleep well?" he asked, setting his axe by the door. "Better than I have in years," Hannah replied honestly. The bunk had been far more comfortable than her old straw tick in town. They ate in companionable silence, until Hannah spoke softly. "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." The verse fell from her lips naturally, like a leaf dropping from an autumn tree. Kevin's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. "Matthew 11, verse 28, he said, surprising her. His voice was rough, as if the words had to push through years of disuse. "You know your scripture," Hannah observed carefully. Kevin set his spoon down. "Used to. Haven't prayed in 20 years. He met her eyes across the table. "Not since Gettysburg." Hannah nodded, understanding in her heart. How many had lost their faith in that terrible war? "The Lord is patient," she said simply. "He waits." "Reckon he'll be waiting a long while then," Kevin replied, but his tone held more weariness than bitterness. After breakfast, Hannah insisted on tackling the cabin's dust and disorder. Kevin watched with a mixture of amusement and concern as she tied a cloth over her gray hair and set to work. "Don't need to earn your keep," he said gruffly. "Nonsense," Hannah replied, already sorting through a pile of items on a shelf. "I'm not here to be idle. Besides," she added with a small smile, "it gives me purpose." Throughout the morning, she organized and cleaned, careful to check with Kevin before moving anything significant. He seemed surprised by her consideration of his preferences, as if expecting her to simply impose her will on his space. In a trunk near the bunk, Hannah discovered a quilt with a torn section. "May I?" she asked, holding it up. Kevin nodded, and she settled in the chair by the window, needle and thread in hand. As she worked, she hummed again, different hymns this time, their melodies filling the cabin's usual silence. Later that afternoon, Hannah stood examining a small patch of earth near the cabin's south wall. The soil looked rich enough, protected from the worst mountain winds by a natural slope. "Might be too late for most plants," Kevin said, coming to stand beside her. "Winter comes early up here." "Root vegetables might make it," Hannah mused. "Turnips, maybe some hardy radishes. Would you mind if I tried?" Kevin shrugged. "Garden tools are in the shed. Used to grow a few things, years back. Never had much luck." Hannah spent the rest of the day preparing the soil, her movements slow but determined. Kevin brought her water and paused in his own work occasionally to watch her. She could feel his eyes on her, perhaps wondering at this old woman who seemed determined to bring life to his solitary world. As evening approached, Kevin emerged from the cabin carrying a bundle of cloth. "Found these," he said, holding out several pieces of women's clothing. "Were my mother's. Might need taking in, but they're warm." Hannah touched the fabrics reverently. Sturdy wool skirts, cotton blouses, even a proper winter coat. "You kept them all this time?" "Couldn't seem to part with them," Kevin admitted. "Ma was about your height, though not as fine-boned. She'd have wanted them used." That night, as darkness settled over the mountain, Hannah sat in her chair by the fire, wearing one of his mother's blouses. It had needed only minor alterations, and the familiar act of sewing had soothed her. Outside, coyotes began their evening chorus, their wild songs echoing off the ridges. Without thinking, Hannah began to sing softly, an old hymn about finding shelter in the Lord. Her voice, though aged, remained clear and true, carrying the melody with quiet confidence. She caught Kevin watching her from his cot. His usual stern expression softened somehow in the firelight. The days that followed fell into a gentle rhythm. Hannah rose early, tending the fire and starting breakfast while Kevin did his morning chores. She worked in her small garden, pleased to see the first green shoots breaking through the soil. The cabin grew cleaner, more ordered, with small touches of comfort appearing. A bunch of dried wildflowers on the table, the mended quilt folded neatly on her bunk, curtains made from feed sacks softening the window's harsh lines. Each evening, as darkness gathered, Hannah would sing. Sometimes hymns, sometimes old ballads her mother had taught her. Kevin never joined in, but she noticed how he grew still when she sang, his massive hands relaxing in his lap, the hard lines of his face easing slightly. One night, after a song about God's mercy, Kevin spoke quietly from his corner. "Used to hear my ma sing that one. When I was small, before the fever took her." Hannah let the silence hold his words carefully. "She gave you a great gift then," she said finally. "Songs stay with us, even when everything else seems lost." Kevin nodded once, turning to stare into the fire. But Hannah saw how his shoulders had loosened, as if some tight-held burden had shifted slightly. The cabin, once as silent as the mountain itself, began to fill with gentle sounds, hymns and humming, the whisper of a broom across the floor, the soft clatter of domestic life. Even Kevin's footsteps seemed lighter somehow, less deliberate. The feared mountain man, who had built his solitude like a wall against the world, found himself strangely soothed by these simple changes. One morning, Hannah caught him pausing in his work, head tilted slightly as she sang while hanging fresh herbs to dry. His expression reminded her of ice melting in spring. Slow, reluctant, but yielding all the same to a warmer touch. That evening, as she prepared their supper, she heard him outside, his deep voice rough but unmistakable, humming a fragment of Amazing Grace as he split wood for the night's fire. Hannah smiled to herself but said nothing, understanding that some transformations needed silence to grow. The late autumn sun cast long shadows across Kevin's property as he worked on the corral fence. Hannah watched from the cabin doorway, admiring how his skilled hands wove new rails into place. The peaceful scene shattered when thundering hoofbeats echoed up the ridge. 5 riders appeared, their horses' flanks lathered from hard riding. Dust coated their dark coats, and brass badges glinted on their vests. 2 wore the blue uniforms of Fort Custer soldiers, their carbines strapped to their saddles. The other 3 men carried themselves with the arrogant confidence of those who wielded paper power rather than honest labor. Kevin straightened slowly, his massive frame tensing as the riders approached. Hannah clutched her shawl tighter, stepping down from the cabin porch. The lead rider, a thin man with cold eyes, dismounted first. He pulled a leather folio from his saddlebag and held up several official-looking documents. "Mining syndicate business," he announced, his voice carrying the sharp edge of authority. "I'm Morton Wells, representing the Silver Creek Mining Corporation." He gestured to his companions. "These gentlemen are from the Territorial Office, and our military escorts ensure everything stays civilized." Hannah's heart nearly stopped when Wells continued. "We're here about the McBride Spring property south of Silver Bluff. Our records show you're Hannah McBride, sister to the late James McBride?" "I am," Hannah said, her voice barely above a whisper. The spring had been in her family for 20 years. James had left it to her in his will, along with the small cabin beside it. Wells's thin lips curved in what might have been called a smile. "That spring feeds directly into Silver Creek. The mining operations require guaranteed water rights. We've filed claim with the Territorial Office." He pulled out another document. "This notice gives you 48 hours to vacate the property." "That's my brother's land," Hannah protested, her aged voice growing stronger. "He left it to me when he passed." "A verbal bequest carries no legal weight, madam." Wells's tone dripped with false sympathy. "Without proper documentation, the territory considers it unclaimed land." Kevin moved forward, positioning himself between Hannah and the riders. His scarred face and imposing presence made 2 of the men shift uneasily in their saddles. Wells's eyes narrowed. "Ah, yes, the notorious Kevin Brandt. We've heard about you in town." His hand rested casually near his coat pocket. "Your reputation won't help here. This is a matter of law." "Law?" Kevin's deep voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Or theft dressed up in fancy paper?" One of the soldiers touched his carbine meaningfully. Wells held up a hand, maintaining his cold smile. "We'll return in 2 days with the sheriff. I suggest you both be reasonable. The syndicate's claim is ironclad." Kevin didn't move. He stood like a mountain, silent and immovable, until the riders wheeled their horses around. 48 hours. After that, we'll remove any obstacles. The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. Hannah waited until the riders disappeared down the ridge before her legs gave way. She sank onto a chair at the cabin's rough table, her hands trembling. "They can't," she whispered. "James wanted me to have that land. He said so before he died." Kevin paced the cabin like a caged bear, his fists clenching and unclenching. "They'll have to come through me first," he growled. "I've seen their kind before. Paper warriors hiding behind badges while they steal what isn't theirs." Hannah looked up at him, her aged face set with determination despite her fear. "No, Kevin. We can't fight them with fists alone. They'll just send more men, more guns." She stood slowly. "Wait here." She went to the corner where her few possessions sat in a worn carpet bag. From its depths, she pulled out a battered leather satchel. James gave me this before he passed. Said to keep it safe, but I never had the heart to look through it after the funeral." Kevin helped her clear space on the table. Hannah opened the satchel with trembling fingers, and together they began sorting through the brittle papers inside. The lamp's yellow light flickered across documents spanning 20 years of her brother's life. Letters, receipts, maps marked with James's careful notes. "There," Kevin said suddenly, his rough finger pointing to a folded sheet. Hannah opened it carefully, hope rising in her chest as she read. "It's the deed," she breathed. "James filed it with the territorial office last spring." Her joy faded as she studied the bottom of the document. "But it's not complete. The territorial clerk never signed it." Kevin leaned closer, squinting at the legal language. "Says here James paid the filing fee. Clerk was supposed to sign and record it the next day." "James died that night," Hannah said softly. "Must have never gone back to finish it." She looked up at Kevin, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "What can we do?" Kevin straightened, his massive frame casting a shadow across the table. "First light tomorrow, I'm riding to the territorial office. That clerk needs to explain why a paid filing wasn't completed." "I'm coming with you," Hannah said firmly. When Kevin started to protest, she held up her hand. "It's my land, Kevin. My brother's legacy. I won't hide up here while others decide its fate." Kevin studied her face for a long moment, seeing the steel beneath her gentle exterior. Finally, he nodded. "We'll take the wagon. Easier on your bones than riding." Hannah began gathering the papers, organizing them carefully. "We'll need everything that proves James's ownership. The original purchase, tax receipts, the filing fee record." As she worked, Kevin watched her with something like admiration. The frightened woman from the auction block was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own worth and wasn't afraid to fight for what was right. "Get some rest," he said gruffly. "Long day tomorrow." Hannah nodded, but her hands kept moving through the papers, determined to arm themselves with every scrap of evidence they could find. The lamp burned late into the night as she worked, her aged fingers trembling but sure, while Kevin cleaned his rifle and checked their supplies for the journey. The mining syndicate's threats hung over them like storm clouds, but neither spoke of violence. They had chosen their weapons: truth, paper, and the stubborn courage to stand their ground. Whether law or force would win remained to be seen, but they would face it together. Outside, a coyote's lonely howl echoed off the ridge, as if nature itself recognized the precarious balance of their situation. Their peaceful days of hymns and garden tending had been shattered, but Hannah felt stronger for having Kevin beside her. Whatever came next, she was no longer alone. The lamp's flame guttered as Hannah finally gathered the last crucial documents. Tomorrow they would ride out to fight for her brother's legacy, armed with nothing but paper and faith. She touched the unsigned deed gently, praying it would be enough. Dawn painted the mountain ridges in soft pink when Kevin began hitching the team to the wagon. His movements were deliberate and careful, checking each buckle and strap twice. Hannah watched from the cabin doorway, clutching her brother's satchel of documents close to her chest. The morning air held autumn's bite, making her grateful for the warm shawl Kevin had given her. "Ready?" Kevin called softly, extending his hand to help her onto the wagon seat. Hannah nodded, gathering her skirts and accepting his steady support. His calloused palm dwarfed her thin fingers, but his touch remained gentle as he lifted her up. The wagon creaked as Kevin settled beside her, taking up the reins. Without a word, they began their journey down the mountain trail toward Silver Bluff. The wooden wheels jolted over rocks and ruts, forcing Hannah to brace herself against the jolts. Kevin drove carefully, choosing the smoothest path possible. The morning sun climbed higher as they descended through stands of pine and aspen. Hannah watched golden leaves flutter down, remembering other autumn journeys along this same trail with her brother James. Her heart ached at the memory, but she straightened her spine. James had trusted her with his legacy, She would not fail him. By midday, the first buildings of Silver Bluff came into view. Hannah's stomach tightened as they approached the town where she had faced such humiliation at the auction. Kevin must have sensed her tension, for he shifted closer on the seat, his solid presence reassuring. As they rolled down the main street, heads turned and whispers followed. Hannah caught fragments of conversation that made her cheeks burn. "That's her, the virgin widow. Brant keeps her hidden up there. Heard she sings hymns all day." Kevin's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes forward, guiding the wagon toward the general store. Several young boys playing marbles in the dust stopped to stare as Kevin helped Hannah down from the wagon. Their eyes were wide but curious, showing none of the cruel mockery she had come to expect. The bell above the store door jangled as they entered. Mrs. Tillman, the shopkeeper's wife, nearly dropped the bolt of calico she was measuring. Hannah focused on her shopping list: flour, coffee, sugar, trying to ignore the whispers behind the shelves. A gentle touch on her arm made her start. It was Mrs. Carver, the town's midwife, a widow herself, who had lost her husband years ago. "Miss Hannah," Mrs. Carver said softly, her kind face creased in a smile. "I wanted to thank you. That hymn you sang at the—" she hesitated. "That day. It was Amazing Grace, wasn't it? Reminded me of my mother's singing." Hannah blinked back sudden tears. "Yes, ma'am. My mother taught it to me." "You have a beautiful voice." Mrs. Carver squeezed her arm. "We could use more music in this town." She glanced at Kevin, who stood like a protective shadow nearby. "And more kindness." Kevin shifted uncomfortably under her approving look, but Hannah saw the tips of his ears redden. Before she could respond, the store's side door opened and several children peeked in. Instead of running at the sight of Kevin, they stared at Hannah with shy interest. "Are you really living up in the mountains now?" one small girl asked, her voice carrying clearly across the store. "Sally Jenkins, mind your manners," Mrs. Carver scolded gently. But Hannah smiled, her heart warming at the child's innocent curiosity. "Yes, I am. There are wild roses growing near the cabin, and sometimes deer come to drink from the creek." The children's eyes widened with wonder. More questions might have followed, but Kevin cleared his throat. "We need to see the pastor," he reminded Hannah quietly. They bid farewell to Mrs. Carver and the children, loading their purchases into the wagon before walking toward the white-painted church at the end of the street. The church doors stood open, welcoming the afternoon breeze. Inside, dust motes danced in the light streaming through plain glass windows. Pastor Samuel Reeves looked up from his Bible as they entered. His weathered face showed no surprise at the unlikely pair approaching his pulpit. "Miss Hannah, Mr. Brant, I've been expecting you." Hannah clutched her brother's satchel tighter. "News travels fast in Silver Bluff." "That it does," the pastor agreed, gesturing for them to sit in the front pew. "I heard about the mining syndicate's claims. And about your brother's spring." Kevin remained standing while Hannah settled onto the worn wooden bench. She removed the unsigned deed from the satchel, handling it like the precious document it was. "James filed this before he died, but the territorial clerk never signed it." Pastor Reeves studied the paper carefully, his expression growing grave. The filing fee was paid. By rights, this should have been completed. He looked up at Hannah. "I'll help you register it properly, but—" he hesitated. "But what?" Kevin's deep voice echoed in the empty church. "Without marriage or a male relative, Hannah's legal standing to defend the property is uncertain." The pastor chose his words carefully. "The territorial courts tend to favor men in property disputes. Even with a completed deed, they might not recognize a single woman's claim." Hannah's heart sank. She had known this truth all her life, how the law often ignored women's rights, but hearing it spoken aloud made it more real. Kevin's massive hands curled into fists at his sides. The ride back to the cabin was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts as the wagon wound its way up the mountain trail. The sun was setting by the time they reached home, painting the western sky in sheets of gold and crimson. Kevin built a fire, while Hannah prepared a simple supper of beans and cornbread. They ate in silence, but Hannah could feel the tension building in Kevin's broad shoulders, like a storm about to break. Finally, as Hannah washed the tin plates by firelight, Kevin spoke. His voice was gruff but direct. "If law's the thing, then maybe we wed." The plate slipped from Hannah's startled fingers, clattering against the wash basin. She turned slowly to face him, her heart pounding. "What did you say?" Kevin stood by the hearth, his scarred face half in shadow. "Pastor said you need a husband to protect your rights. Well," he gestured vaguely between them. "Here I am." Hannah stared at him, speechless. This giant of a man, feared by most who knew him, was offering marriage. Not for love or companionship, but to defend her property. The proposal was as unromantic as could be imagined, yet something in her chest tightened at his gruff sincerity. "Kevin," she began softly, "you don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," he cut her off. "But it makes sense. You need protection. Legal protection. I can give you that." He paused, then added quietly, "Unless the thought of being married to me is too—" He trailed off, unable to finish. Hannah studied him in the firelight. This man who had purchased her freedom, given her shelter, and now offered his name to protect her rights. Not once had he demanded anything in return. Perhaps it wasn't the marriage she had dreamed of in her youth, but there was honor in his offer, and something more, something neither of them was ready to name. The fire crackled in the silence between them, throwing dancing shadows on the cabin walls as they both waited for her answer. The morning sun painted the cabin's rough-hewn walls with golden light as Hannah stood at the wood stove, her hands trembling slightly as she stirred a pot of steaming oatmeal. The events of the previous evening, Kevin's unexpected proposal, kept replaying in her mind. She had not given him an answer yet, the shock of his blunt offer still settling in her bones. Kevin's heavy footsteps on the porch announced his return from the morning chores. He ducked through the doorway, his massive frame filling the space, but there was an unusual hesitancy in his movement. In his large, calloused hands, he held a small bunch of wildflowers. Purple lupins and bright yellow daisies gathered from the ridge. "Found these," he muttered, extending the flowers awkwardly. "Thought maybe you'd like them." Hannah stared at the simple bouquet, then let out a soft laugh that surprised them both. The sight of this feared mountain man holding delicate wildflowers struck her as both endearing and absurd. "Thank you, Kevin," she said, accepting them with a warm smile. "They're lovely." She placed the flowers in a tin cup with water, setting them on the table where morning light caught their petals. The familiar routine of breakfast helped ease the tension between them. Bowls of oatmeal sweetened with the last of their honey, cornbread left from supper, strong coffee in tin cups. As the days passed, their unlikely courtship unfolded in quiet, practical ways. Kevin spent 3 days crafting a rocking chair for Hannah, his skilled hands shaping the pine boards with careful precision. She would pause in her work to watch him, marveling at how such large fingers could manage such delicate cuts and joins. "My pa taught me woodworking," he explained one afternoon, sanding the chair's arms smooth. "Said a man should know how to build things that last." Hannah ran her hand along the polished wood. "He taught you well." In return, Hannah shared the hymns and psalms she had carried in her heart through decades of loneliness. At first, Kevin just listened as she sang while working, but gradually he began to hum along, his deep voice blending with hers in the evening quiet. Their days fell into a steady rhythm. Dawn found them sharing coffee before Kevin went to split wood or repair fences, while Hannah tended the small garden she had planted. The root vegetables were beginning to sprout, tiny green promises pushing through the dark soil. At noon, they would meet at the creek to fetch water, Kevin carrying the heavy buckets while Hannah gathered wild berries or herbs. But it was the evenings that changed them most. As darkness crept over the mountains and coyotes began their distant songs, they would sit by the firelight and share stories of the people they had lost. Hannah spoke of her preacher fiancé, Thomas, killed at Gettysburg before they could marry. Kevin, after long silence, told of his mother's gentle faith and his father's strong hands, both taken by fever one cruel winter. "I never thought to have a home again," Kevin admitted one night, staring into the flames. "After the war, seemed easier to stay away from folks." Hannah nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Loneliness becomes a habit," she said softly, "but not always a good one." A week passed this way, each day building trust between them like the layers of a stone wall, solid, deliberate, meant to last. On the 7th day, Kevin hitched the wagon early, telling Hannah they needed supplies from town. The ride to Silver Bluff was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Hannah noticed Kevin had put on his best shirt, faded but clean, and had trimmed his beard. Her heart quickened, sensing something important in his careful preparation. Instead of stopping at the general store, Kevin guided the wagon straight to the church. Pastor Reeves stood on the steps, as if expecting them, and several townspeople lingered nearby, curiosity plain on their faces. Kevin helped Hannah down from the wagon, then did something that made the watching crowd gasp. He walked straight up the church aisle and knelt. The feared mountain man, who had made grown men step back in fear, dropped to one knee on the worn floorboards. "Hannah McBride," his voice filled the church, steady despite the emotion thick in his throat. "You deserve more than a business arrangement. You deserve honor and care and—" He paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily to him. "And I aim to give you those things, if you'll have me. Will you be my wife?" Hannah stood in the aisle, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. The watching townspeople seemed to hold their breath, some looking astonished, others visibly moved by the scene before them. "Yes," Hannah whispered, then louder so all could hear. "Yes, Kevin Brandt, I will." A murmur rippled through the congregation. Mrs. Carver dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Even old Mr. Peterson, who had sneered at Hannah during the auction, looked thoughtful. Kevin rose to his feet, taking Hannah's hand in his. His touch was gentle, belying his great strength. Pastor Reeves stepped forward, beaming, but Kevin held up his hand. "One more thing," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Hannah, I want you to know, this ain't about ownership. Never was, never will be. This is about companionship, like you always dreamed of. And I swear before God and these witnesses, I'll spend my days trying to be worthy of it." Hannah squeezed his hand, unable to speak through her tears, but her eyes, bright with joy and something deeper than gratitude, said everything that needed saying. The morning sun streamed through the church windows, blessing them with light, as the town of Silver Bluff witnessed an unlikely love story unfold in their midst. Pastor Reeves cleared his throat, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Shall we discuss the wedding arrangements?" Word traveled fast in Silver Bluff. By sunset of Kevin's church proposal, every soul in town knew that the fearsome mountain man would wed the elderly Hannah McBride. The news sparked a change in how folks treated Hannah. Gone were the sneers and whispers of virgin spinster. Now, women nodded respectfully when she passed, and men tipped their hats. Mrs. Carver led the charge of support, gathering a circle of widows at her parlor the very next afternoon. "Hannah needs a proper wedding dress," she declared, pulling out a chest of fabric scraps. "Every bride deserves to feel beautiful on her day." Hannah sat among them, her weathered hands smoothing pieces of cream-colored muslin and delicate lace as the women chattered and planned. Her eyes grew misty when Mrs. Peterson contributed a length of silk ribbon, saved from her own wedding 30 years prior. "Never thought I'd have cause to wear a wedding dress," Hannah admitted softly, touching the fabrics with reverence. "At my age." "Nonsense," Mrs. Carver cut in firmly. "Love doesn't keep a calendar, Hannah McBride, and that mountain man of yours looks at you like you're made of pure gold." The ladies worked steadily through the week, their needles flashing in the lamplight as they pieced together a simple but elegant dress. Hannah insisted it be practical enough to wear again, but the widows added subtle touches of beauty. Tiny pearl buttons down the back, delicate embroidery at the collar. Meanwhile, Kevin threw himself into preparing their home. The cabin's roof had leaked during the last rain, so he spent long days replacing worn shingles, his powerful frame silhouetted against the autumn sky as he worked. Inside, he crafted a new table from pine boards, larger than his old one, with 2 proper chairs instead of the rough bench he'd used alone. "A family ought to sit together proper," he explained gruffly when Hannah admired his work. The word family hung in the air between them, full of meaning. Hannah cleaned and organized while Kevin labored, setting up her few possessions alongside his. The cabin slowly transformed. Curtains at the windows, dried flowers in tin cans, a braided rug by the hearth. Each small touch made the space feel more like a home meant for 2. They spent evenings discussing practical matters, particularly the spring and its deed. Kevin built a special compartment behind a loose stone in the fireplace to store the precious document. "Even if those syndicate men return, they can't take what they can't find," he said, showing Hannah how to work the hidden catch. She nodded, grateful for his foresight. Not everyone in town approved of the match. Outside the saloon, rough men gathered to scoff and speculate. "It's a sham, plain and simple," declared Tom Wilson, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "That brute's just after her water rights." "And what's he want with a 70-year-old virgin anyway?" Another added with a crude laugh. But for every doubter, there seemed to be 2 supporters. The schoolchildren, led by Mrs. Carver's youngest daughter, practiced hymns daily for the ceremony. Their sweet voices drifted through town as they sang "Amazing Grace" and "Blessed be the tie that binds." The little church was transformed as the wedding day approached. Women gathered pine boughs from the surrounding hills, filling the space with their fresh scent. Candles were placed in every window, and clean white cloth draped the altar. On the evening before the wedding, Hannah and Kevin shared what would be their last supper before becoming husband and wife. She had made a hearty stew, and the cabin was warm and fragrant with fresh-baked bread. They sat at Kevin's newly crafted table, the lamplight casting soft shadows on the walls. For a while, they ate in comfortable silence, each lost in thought about the magnitude of what lay ahead. Finally, Hannah set down her spoon. "Kevin," she said softly, "I need to speak plain about something." He looked up, his scarred face attentive. "Speak your mind." "I'm not a young bride," she began, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "I'm frail sometimes, and my hands shake when I'm tired. I can't promise how many years." "Hannah," Kevin interrupted gently, "I don't measure life in years. I measure it in worth." She nodded, tears threatening. "And I worry about your reputation in town. The things they say about your temper, about violence. I believe in your goodness, but others." Kevin reached across the table, his massive hand engulfing her smaller one. "I've done things I ain't proud of," he admitted. "Used my fists when words would have served better. But I swear to you, Hannah McBride, that rage ain't who I am anymore. You've shown me a different way." "Through faith?" she asked softly. "Through mercy," he replied. "Watching you face those auction sneers with dignity. Seeing how you treat folks kind, even when they don't deserve it. Makes a man want to be better." Hannah turned her hand in his, their fingers intertwining. "I trust you, Kevin Brandt. With my life, with my heart, with whatever years the good Lord grants us." "And I trust you," he responded, his voice rough with emotion. "Never thought I'd trust anyone again, but here we are." They sat there, hands clasped across the table, as the first snow of winter began to fall outside. Tiny flakes danced past the window, glinting in the lamplight like stars. The cabin was quiet, except for the crackling of the fire and their soft breathing. In that moment, all the preparations, the dress, the roof repairs, the hidden deed, the pine boughs, seemed secondary to this simple truth. Two lonely souls had found each other against all odds, and tomorrow they would pledge their lives together before God and community. "Reckon we should get some rest," Kevin said finally, though he didn't release her hand. "Big day tomorrow." Hannah smiled, feeling peace settle over her like a warm blanket. "Indeed it is. A blessed day." Through the window, they watched the snow continue to fall, each flake a promise of new beginnings. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys, but for now, they sat content in the knowledge that neither of them would face the future alone. The morning dawned crisp and bright, winter sunlight sparkling off fresh snow. Inside Silver Bluff's small church, excitement hummed as townsfolk filed into the wooden pews. Pine boughs and red ribbons decorated every window, and dozens of candles flickered in the early light. The scent of fresh evergreen mixed with beeswax, creating an atmosphere of reverent celebration. Mrs. Carver supervised last-minute preparations, straightening the white cloth on the altar and adjusting the flower arrangements crafted from dried blooms and winter berries. The schoolchildren, dressed in their Sunday best, whispered and fidgeted in the front pews, ready to sing the hymns they'd practiced all week. In the small back room of the church, Hannah McBride stood before a clouded mirror, her trembling fingers smoothing the simple white dress the widows had sewn. The cream-colored muslin fell in gentle folds, adorned with delicate lace at the collar and pearl buttons down the back. Over her shoulders lay a new white shawl, a gift from the community, embroidered with tiny flowers along the edges. "You look beautiful," Pastor Reeves said softly from the doorway. His kind eyes crinkled with genuine warmth. "Are you ready, my dear?" Hannah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. At 70 years old, she had never expected to be a bride. The pastor offered his arm, and she took it gratefully, steadying herself against his strength. At the front of the church, Kevin Brandt shifted uncomfortably in his dark coat, the only proper piece of clothing he owned. He had shaved his weathered face clean that morning, revealing old scars usually hidden by his beard. His huge hands, more accustomed to rope and axe handles, fumbled with the borrowed tie at his throat. The organ wheezed to life, playing the first notes of Amazing Grace. The congregation rose, turning to watch as Hannah appeared in the doorway on Pastor Reeves's arm. Kevin's breath caught at the sight of her, small and dignified, her white hair crowned with a simple wreath of evergreen, her aged face glowing with joy. Hannah's steps were slow but steady as she made her way down the aisle. The children's choir began to sing, their young voices rising clear and sweet in the morning air. Through tear-blurred eyes, she saw Kevin waiting for her, his massive frame somehow softened by emotion. They had almost reached the altar when the church doors burst open with a thunderous crack. "Stop this farce immediately!" a harsh voice commanded. Armed men in dust-covered coats strode down the aisle, their boots echoing on the wooden floor. Two wore silver badges of the mining syndicate, while behind them came soldiers from Fort Custer, rifles at the ready. The congregation gasped, and several women screamed. "What is the meaning of this?" Pastor Reeves demanded, still holding Hannah's arm protectively. The lead syndicate man, a sharp-featured fellow named Morton, pulled out a sheaf of papers. "We have evidence that Kevin Brandt is wanted for assault and battery in 3 territories. Furthermore, we have documentation proving the McBride Spring belongs to the mining company through legal purchase." "That's a lie!" Hannah cried out, her voice stronger than she felt. "I have the deed." "Your brother's signature means nothing without proper registration," Morton sneered. These papers are signed by the territorial governor himself." Kevin had remained still, his face darkening with rage, but his eyes fixed on Hannah. When two soldiers approached with shackles, his massive hands clenched into fists. "Don't!" Hannah pleaded softly. "Please, Kevin." "No violence. Not here." The struggle happened anyway. One of the syndicate men grabbed Kevin's arm roughly, and instinct took over. Kevin's elbow shot back, catching the man in the face. More men piled in, and the church erupted into chaos. Women screamed and children cried as pews were overturned in the scuffle. Kevin fought with desperate restraint, trying not to hurt anyone seriously, but he was overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The soldiers joined the fray, rifle butts striking his broad back. Through it all, his eyes never left Hannah's face, as if drawing strength from her presence. "Stop! Please stop!" Hannah screamed, as they finally forced the shackles onto Kevin's wrists. Blood trickled from a cut above his eye, and his dark coat was torn at the shoulder. Pastor Reeves held Hannah upright as her legs threatened to give way. The congregation watched in horror as Kevin was dragged toward the door, his boots leaving scuff marks on the pristine aisle runner. "Hannah," Kevin called out, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm sorry. I never meant—" A rifle butt to his ribs cut off his words. Hannah broke free from the pastor's grip, stumbling forward, but Mrs. Carver caught her before she could follow. "The spring is company property now," Morton announced to the stunned church. "Any interference will be dealt with severely. This man will face justice for his crimes." Through the open church doors, a new horror became visible. Smoke rose thick and black against the morning sky, coming from the direction of Kevin's cabin. Hannah's heart seized as she realized what it meant. Hired thugs had set their home ablaze while everyone was at the church. "No," she whispered, her legs finally giving way. She collapsed into the front pew, her white dress crumpling around her. "Dear God, no!" The children's choir huddled together, some crying softly. Their sheet music lay scattered across the floor, trampled by boots and stained with mud. The pine boughs hung crooked, their fresh scent now mixing with gunpowder and smoke. Hannah sat motionless in the pew, watching helplessly as Kevin was forced into a waiting wagon. His eyes found hers one last time, full of sorrow and unspoken words. Then he was gone, the wagon rattling away toward the fort. The congregation stood frozen, the beautiful morning shattered beyond recognition. Through the church windows, they could see the smoke continuing to rise, thick and cruel against the winter sky. All their preparations, all their hopes, reduced to ashes in mere minutes. Pastor Reeves placed a gentle hand on Hannah's shoulder as she wept, her tears falling onto the white shawl sewn with such care and love. The candles still flickered on the windowsills, but their light seemed hollow now, mocking the joy that had filled the church just moments before. Outside, the smoke from Kevin's burning cabin rose higher, carrying with it their dreams of a shared life, of redemption, of love found late but true. Hannah's shoulders shook with silent sobs as she clutched the marriage license that would never be signed, while around her, the scattered flowers and fallen pine boughs marked the ruins of what should have been the happiest morning of her life. The evening shadows stretched long across the empty church as Hannah sat alone by the pot-bellied stove, still wearing her ruined wedding dress. The white muslin was wrinkled and stained, much like her spirits. She pulled the borrowed shawl tighter around her thin shoulders, but the chill seemed to come from within. Through the frosted windows, she could see smoke still rising from the remains of Kevin's cabin on the distant ridge. Their home, destroyed before they could even share it properly. The thought brought fresh tears to her eyes. Mrs. Carver approached quietly, carrying a steaming cup of tea. "Here, dear," she said softly, pressing the warm cup into Hannah's trembling hands. "You need something to steady yourself." "Much obliged," Hannah whispered, though she made no move to drink. The cup's warmth helped, but could not thaw the ice of despair in her heart. Other townswomen gathered nearby, speaking in hushed tones. They had cleared away the scattered pine boughs and righted the overturned pews, but evidence of the morning's violence remained. Scuff marks on the floor, a broken hymnal, Kevin's blood dried dark on the altar steps. "You can stay with us tonight," Mrs. Carver offered, smoothing Hannah's disheveled white hair. "We have a spare room." Hannah shook her head. "I thank you, but I cannot impose." Her voice cracked. "I seem to bring trouble wherever I go. First as the aging spinster, now as the bride who brought violence to God's house." "Now, that's enough of such talk," came Pastor Reeves's firm voice. He pulled a chair close to the stove, his kind eyes meeting Hannah's tear-filled ones. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, dear sister. Sometimes His greatest strength is revealed through our deepest weakness." "What strength can there be in this?" Hannah gestured helplessly at her wedding dress, at the empty church. "Kevin sits in jail, our home is ashes, and those men will take everything my brother left me." The pastor opened his worn Bible, pages softly rustling in the evening quiet. "Remember Paul's words, 'When I am weak, then I am strong.' The Lord often chooses the most unlikely vessels for His work." Hannah stared into the stove's glowing coals, remembering Kevin's face as they dragged him away. Such gentleness in those eyes, even as violence surrounded him. "I don't know what to do," she admitted softly. "Start with prayer," Pastor Reeves advised, patting her hand. "Then face tomorrow with faith. The Lord hasn't brought you this far to abandon you now." As darkness settled over Silver Bluff, the women helped Hannah change out of her wedding dress. Mrs. Carver wrapped her in a warm shawl and tried once more to convince her to accept shelter, but Hannah remained firm. She would sleep in Kevin's wagon tonight, close to what remained of their shared dreams. The next morning dawned cold and clear. Hannah forced herself to eat a small breakfast of hardtack and coffee, then squared her thin shoulders. She had spent too many years letting others determine her worth. Today, she would act. The walk to the sheriff's office seemed endless. Every step brought stares and whispers from townspeople going about their morning business. Hannah kept her head high, though her heart pounded. At the jail, Sheriff Ellery regarded her with tired eyes. "Mrs. McBride," he said, then caught himself. "Miss McBride. I'm sorry about yesterday." "May I see him?" she asked simply. The sheriff nodded, leading her to the cells in back. Kevin sat on a narrow cot, his massive frame making the space seem even smaller. Purple bruises marked his face, and his dark coat was still torn and bloodied. Yet his eyes lit up at the sight of Hannah. "You shouldn't have come," he said gruffly, but his hands gripped the iron bars as if wanting to reach for her. "Of course I came." Hannah moved closer, her aged fingers brushing his scarred knuckles. "Are you badly hurt?" "I've had worse." Kevin's voice softened. "But you need to go, Hannah. Those syndicate men, they're dangerous. Don't risk yourself for me." "I won't abandon you," she said firmly. "God brought us together for a purpose, Kevin Brandt. I mean to see it through." A ghost of a smile touched his battered face. "Stubborn woman." "Yes," she agreed. "And you knew that when you bought me." Sheriff Ellery cleared his throat. "Miss McBride, I hate to rush you, but visiting hours are almost over." Hannah nodded, squeezing Kevin's fingers one last time. "Keep faith," she whispered. "I'll find a way." Outside, the morning sun had barely warmed the air. Hannah walked slowly to where Kevin's wagon stood near the church, its familiar bulk now her only shelter. She climbed carefully inside, looking at the few possessions they shared. Cooking pots, worn blankets, her brother's old satchel. The satchel. Hannah pulled it into her lap, fingers trembling as she opened it once more. She had gone through these papers so many times, searching for proof of her claim to the spring, but perhaps, in her fear and hurry, she had missed something. One by one, she removed the brittle papers, examining each carefully. Letters, receipts, old maps. And there, stuck to the bottom of the satchel, a sealed envelope she had overlooked before. The paper was yellow with age, but the territorial judge's seal was still clear in the red wax. Hannah's heart began to pound as she carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single document, the ink faded but legible. It was a deed to the Spring property, properly notarized and signed by both the territorial judge and the county clerk. Her brother had secured their legal claim after all. "Oh, thank you, Lord," Hannah whispered, tears blurring her vision. This was what they needed, proof that could free Kevin and stop the syndicate's theft. That evening, as the sun set in streaks of amber and rose, Hannah knelt beside her makeshift bed in the wagon. The signed deed lay safely hidden in her bodice, close to her heart. Outside, she could hear the night wind rising, carrying the lonely cry of coyotes. "Dear Father," she prayed softly, her clasped hands steady despite her age. "I am old and weak, but you are strong. Give me courage for what lies ahead. Help me protect those I love and stand firm for justice." The stars emerged one by one, bright and cold in the winter sky. Hannah remained kneeling, drawing strength from the familiar words of prayer. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight she had hope. And hope, she knew, was God's greatest gift to the weary. Through the wagon's canvas, she could see the dim lights of Silver Bluff below, and beyond them, the dark shape of the ridge where Kevin's cabin had stood. Soon, she promised silently. Soon they would rebuild what was lost, stronger than before. Dawn broke over Silver Bluff with streaks of pink and gold painting the sky. Hannah sat in Kevin's wagon, smoothing her faded black dress with trembling hands. The precious deed lay folded against her heart, tucked securely in her bodice. She had prayed through most of the night, drawing strength from remembered scriptures and hymns. "The Lord is my light and my salvation," she whispered, pinning her gray hair neatly beneath her best bonnet. "Whom shall I fear?" The morning air bit cold as Hannah stepped down from the wagon. Her old bones protested, but she forced herself to stand straight. A few early risers paused their chores to watch as she made her way toward the sheriff's office. Word spread quickly in their small town. By the time Hannah reached the wooden sidewalk, several townsfolk had gathered to follow at a respectful distance. Mrs. Carver hurried to walk beside her, offering silent support. Children whispered and pointed from doorways. Even the local telegraph operator left his post to join the growing crowd. Hannah's heart pounded as she approached the sheriff's office. Through the window she could see several men inside, the syndicate representatives in their fine coats, 2 soldiers from Fort Custer standing at attention, and Sheriff Ellery behind his desk looking weary. They were likely discussing Kevin's transfer to territorial prison. "Would you like me to go in with you?" Mrs. Carver asked softly. Hannah shook her head. "This is something I must do alone." She paused, then added, "Though I wouldn't say no to your prayers." Taking a deep breath, Hannah pushed open the heavy door. The bell above jangled, drawing all eyes to her slight figure. The syndicate leader, a man named Morton with cold eyes and an expensive watch chain, sneered at her presence. "Miss McBride," Sheriff Ellery said, rising from his desk, "this isn't a good time. We're conducting official business regarding the prisoner." "That's why I'm here." Hannah's voice quavered slightly, but she forced herself to continue. "I have business of my own to present." Behind her, townsfolk began filling the office doorway and pressing against the windows. Pastor Reeves appeared, making his way through the crowd to stand near Hannah. His presence gave her courage. "What business could an old spinster possibly have with us?" Morton demanded. "The Spring territory belongs to the mining syndicate now. We have papers proving our claim." "Forged papers," Hannah said clearly. The room fell silent at her accusation. "I have the true deed here. signed and sealed by both territorial judge and county clerk. Her fingers shook slightly as she withdrew the document from her bodice, but her voice grew stronger. From the cells in back, she heard movement, Kevin listening intently. Sheriff Ellery took the deed carefully, examining the aged paper. The syndicate men crowded around, their faces darkening as they saw the official seals and signatures. "This land is mine," Hannah declared, standing as tall as her 70 years would allow. "Mine by law and by blood. My brother Samuel McBride registered it proper before his death, leaving it to me as his sole heir." "Let me see that," Morton snapped, trying to snatch the paper, but Sheriff Ellery held it away. "Careful now," the sheriff warned. "This here's a legal document." "I recognize Judge Morrison's seal, and that's surely County Clerk Peterson's signature. Dates match up too." Pastor Reeves stepped forward, his Bible in hand. "Scripture tells us that a false witness shall not go unpunished, and he that speaks lies shall perish." His quiet words carried weight in the crowded room. "The truth of Hannah's claim stands before us all." "This is ridiculous," Morton blustered. "You can't possibly accept the word of a penniless widow over a legitimate business enterprise. We have investors waiting, contracts signed." "Contracts based on false claims," Sheriff Ellery interrupted. "This deed proves Miss McBride owns those water rights, fair and square." He looked at the soldiers. "You men were brought here under pretense of enforcing legal ownership. Well, here's your legal owner." The soldiers exchanged glances, then stepped away from the syndicate men. Hannah felt tears threatening but held them back. Instead, she turned toward the cells. "Sheriff," she said firmly, "I want Kevin Brandt released. He was protecting my property from theft. There are no charges that can rightfully hold him." A murmur of agreement rose from the townspeople watching. Sheriff Ellery nodded slowly, taking the ring of keys from his desk. "No!" Morton's face had grown red with fury. His hand moved toward his coat, where a pistol surely waited. "You can't—" The click of Sheriff Ellery's shotgun cut him off. "I wouldn't," the sheriff said mildly. "Assaulting a landowner and threatening an officer of the law? That's prison time, Mr. Morton. Best you and your men clear out while you can." The crowd parted as the syndicate men backed toward the door, Morton's face twisted with impotent rage. "This isn't over," he spat. "Yes," Hannah said quietly. "It is." The sound of chains rattling made her turn. Sheriff Ellery was unlocking Kevin's cell, then his shackles. The big man stepped out, rubbing his wrists where the iron had chafed. His eyes found Hannah's, filled with a mix of pride and wonder. Someone in the crowd began to clap. Others joined in, the sound swelling until it filled the small office. Mrs. Carver wiped tears from her eyes. The children cheered. Even the sheriff allowed himself a small smile. "Well done, sister," Pastor Reeves said softly, touching Hannah's shoulder. "Well done indeed." Hannah barely heard him. She was watching Kevin make his way toward her through the crowd. He moved carefully, mindful of his size among the celebrating townspeople. When he reached her, he took her small hand in his large, calloused one. "You did it," he said simply. Hannah squeezed his fingers. "We did it. Together." The morning sun streamed through the office windows, catching the silver in Hannah's hair and the tears on her cheeks. She had stood before the powerful and spoken truth. She had claimed her rightful place. Most importantly, she had freed the man who had first freed her from shame. Around them, the townsfolk continued to celebrate, their voices full of joy and triumph. The sound of their happiness spilled out into the streets of Silver Bluff, carrying with it the story of how a widow's courage had overcome injustice and how truth had finally prevailed. The late morning sun cast long shadows across Silver Bluff's main street as the syndicate men stumbled out of the sheriff's office. Morton's face had turned an ugly shade of red, his expensive coat wrinkled from the hasty retreat. He gathered his men near the church steps, their boots scuffing against the wooden planks. The sharp metallic sound of weapons being drawn cut through the air. Morton's gang pulled revolvers from their holsters, the steel glinting in the sunlight. The hired muscle, 4 rough-looking men with trail-worn clothes and hard eyes, spread out in a practiced formation. "Last chance," Morton shouted toward the sheriff's office. "Either surrender the deed or there'll be bloodshed." The townsfolk who had been celebrating inside now spilled out onto the street. They clustered uncertainly behind Hannah and Kevin, who stood shoulder to shoulder in the doorway. Sheriff Ellery positioned himself to one side, his shotgun ready but pointed at the ground. "Think careful about what you're doing," the sheriff warned. "You're outnumbered." Indeed, more townspeople were emerging from shops and houses, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Carver guided several children to safety behind the general store. The telegraph operator watched nervously from his window. Pastor Reeves stood firm on the church steps, his Bible clutched to his chest. Kevin's hand moved toward the rifle slung across his back, the motion smooth, familiar from years of violent confrontations. Hannah felt her heart skip as she watched his fingers curl around the wooden stock. The crowd held its breath, knowing his reputation for swift and brutal action. But then something remarkable happened. Kevin's grip on the rifle loosened. With deliberate slowness, he unslung the weapon and held it out to his side. "No," he said, his deep voice carrying across the tense street. "Not this time." Hannah watched in amazement as Kevin carefully set the rifle down on the sheriff's office porch. He straightened up, standing tall and unarmed before the armed men. "We'll defend this land with truth, not blood," Kevin declared. The words seemed to ring in the morning air. "I've seen enough killing to last 10 lifetimes. This here's Hannah's property, legal and proper. You want to take it, you'll have to do it through the courts." His words struck the gathered townsfolk like a physical force. Many had known Kevin only as a frightening figure, quick to violence. Now they saw something different in the big man, a choice for peace, a rejection of his savage reputation. Morton's men shifted uneasily, their gun hands wavering. They looked around at the growing crowd of townspeople, shopkeepers, farmers, miners, ordinary folk who were standing their ground, armed with nothing but the conviction that right must prevail over might. "You're soft, Brant," Morton sneered, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "Gone weak over some dried-up old woman?" "No," Kevin answered calmly. "Found my strength. Real strength ain't in how many men you can beat down. It's in knowing when to stand firm without raising a fist." Hannah felt tears welling in her eyes. She reached out and took Kevin's large, calloused hand in her small one. He squeezed her fingers gently, never taking his steady gaze off the armed men. The moment stretched out like molasses, thick with tension. Then one of Morton's hired guns lowered his weapon. "I ain't shooting unarmed folks," he muttered. "Not for any price." A second man followed suit, holstering his revolver. The remaining 2 looked uncertainly at Morton, whose face had drained of color. He was realizing that his power, built on threats and violence, was crumbling in the face of simple dignity. "You'll regret this," Morton blustered, but his words rang hollow. He backed down the church steps, his remaining men falling in behind him. "The syndicate has friends in high places. We'll see who—" "No, Mr. Morton," Hannah spoke up, her clear voice cutting through his threats. "You won't. You'll withdraw your claim, legal and proper. Otherwise, I'll make sure every newspaper from here to Denver knows how you tried to steal an old widow's water rights with forged papers and hired guns." A ripple of approval went through the crowd. Morton's face burned with shame as he realized how the story would sound. Wealthy businessmen attempting to rob a defenseless woman, only to be stopped by the moral courage of a reformed outlaw. "The syndicate hereby withdraws all claims to the McBride Spring property," Morton ground out through clenched teeth. He turned on his heel and strode away, not looking back as his men followed. The tension broke like a summer storm passing. People began to smile, then laugh. someone started singing Amazing Grace, the hymn rising sweet and clear in the morning air. Others joined in, their voices swelling in celebration of victory won not through violence, but through standing firm in truth. Pastor Reeves stepped forward, beaming. "The wedding?" he reminded them. "We still have a wedding to perform, if the bride and groom are willing." Hannah looked up at Kevin, seeing in his eyes the same joy that filled her heart. "I'm willing," she said softly. "More than ever," Kevin replied. The crowd parted, forming an impromptu honor guard as Hannah and Kevin walked toward the church. The pine boughs still decorated the entrance, their fresh scent mingling with the crisp autumn air. Mrs. Carver hurried ahead to straighten Hannah's simple white shawl, while someone else brushed dust from Kevin's dark coat. They paused at the church steps, where just moments before armed men had stood. Now those same steps would lead them to their vows, their future together. "Reckon this is what you meant," Kevin said quietly to Hannah, "about having faith in something bigger than bullets." Hannah squeezed his hand. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," she replied, her voice trembling with happiness. "Sometimes he uses a stubborn mountain man to teach an old widow about courage. And sometimes he uses a frightened woman to show a warrior the power of mercy." The hymn continued as they walked into the church together, followed by their neighbors, no longer mere observers, but witnesses to a transformation. Where violence had threatened, peace had prevailed. Where hatred might have bloomed, love had grown instead. Inside the church, sunlight streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes in golden shafts. The same light that had earlier glinted on gun barrels now illuminated faces bright with joy, transforming the scene of near bloodshed into one of celebration and new beginnings. Kevin and Hannah took their places before Pastor Reeves, ready at last to speak their vows. The hymn faded to reverent silence, broken only by happy sniffles from the congregation. They had all witnessed something remarkable. Not just the triumph of truth over force, but the power of choosing mercy over vengeance, love over fear. Through the open church doors, the fresh breeze carried away the last trace of tension, replacing it with the sweet promise of autumn and new beginnings. The morning that had begun with threats of violence was transforming into one of the most joyous celebrations Silver Bluff had ever seen. The morning sun streamed through the church windows, painting golden patterns across the wooden pews. Silver Bluff's townsfolk filed in quietly, their Sunday best brushed clean, their faces expectant. Children smoothed their hair and straightened their collars, ready to sing. This time, no threats loomed. Only joy and anticipation filled the sacred space. Kevin stood at the altar, his massive frame somehow softened in a fresh white shirt and dark vest. His usual hardness had melted into something gentler, though his eyes remained watchful. Pastor Reeves stood beside him, Bible open, a warm smile crinkling his weathered face. The church door opened, and Hannah appeared in the entrance. She wore a simple blue dress the color of summer skies, sewn by Mrs. Carver and the other widows. Her silver hair was crowned with a wreath of late wildflowers. Though her steps were slow with age, she carried herself with quiet dignity. Gone was the shame that had bent her shoulders at the auction block. In its place shone the courage of a woman who had faced down evil with nothing but truth and faith. Kevin's breath caught visibly as he watched her approach. Tears welled in his hard-worn eyes, catching everyone by surprise. This man who had survived decades of violence was undone by the sight of his elderly bride. Pastor Reeves began the ceremony, his voice steady and clear. "Dearly beloved, we gather here today." The vows rang out pure and true in the hushed church. Kevin bowed his head as he spoke, his deep voice rough with emotion. "I, Kevin Brandt, take thee, Hannah McBride." Tears tracked down his scarred cheeks, but he didn't wipe them away. Hannah's "I do" came as a whisper through happy sobs, but it carried to every corner of the church. When Kevin slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, His huge hands were gentle as butterfly wings. The children's choir rose to sing, their young voices lifting in praise. Great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning new mercies I see. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Pastor Reeves declared. The congregation burst into applause and cheers. Several of the miners wiped their eyes with rough sleeves. Kevin bent down and placed a tender kiss on Hannah's forehead. She reached up to touch his cheek, her eyes shining with joy. The townsfolk surrounded them with congratulations. Where once they had seen only a frightening mountain man and a useless old maid, now they recognized something profound. A love story that spoke of redemption, of mercy triumphing over violence, of faith rewarded after decades of patience. Hannah was no longer the scorned, virgin widow, but a respected matriarch who had shown remarkable courage. And Kevin, the feared brute, had been transformed by love into a man of peace, proving that God's grace could soften the hardest heart. Autumn painted the ridge in amber and gold as neighbors gathered at Kevin and Hannah's homestead. The charred remains of the old cabin had been cleared away, making room for new beginnings. Men from Silver Bluff hefted fresh-cut pine logs into place, their shoulders straining against the weight. The sound of axes and hammers filled the crisp mountain air. Women bustled around outdoor cooking fires, stirring huge pots of venison stew and baking cornbread in cast-iron skillets. The aroma of food and fresh sawdust mingled on the breeze. Children darted between the workers' legs, giggling as they chased Mrs. Carver's donated chickens around the yard. Hannah stood wrapped in her wool shawl, her silver hair catching the sunlight. She directed the placement of the new furniture with quiet authority. "The table should face the window," she called out, "so we can see the sunset during supper." Kevin worked steadily at the main beam above the stone hearth. His massive hands, once known only for violence, now moved with careful precision as he carved into the wood. Letter by letter, his knife etched deep. Mercy built this home. The words would remind all who entered of the power of forgiveness. As weeks passed, their cabin became more than just a shelter. Widows from town began leaving their children with Hannah while they worked, knowing they would find patient instruction and warm meals. Orphans who once went hungry discovered that a knock on the cabin door brought hot stew and gentle words. Even weary travelers found rest there, welcomed by the glow of lamplight in the window. Each evening, Kevin and Hannah sat in their matching rocking chairs beside the hearth. The firelight softened the scars on his weathered face as he listened to Hannah's hymns. Her voice, though aged, carried the strength of lifelong faith. Outside their window, the contested spring flowed freely, now secured for all the town to share. Where loneliness and shame had once filled their days, now laughter echoed through the cabin. Hannah's dignity shone in the way she carried herself, no longer burdened by cruel whispers about her past. Kevin's gentleness surprised everyone who remembered his fearsome reputation. One night, as the lamp burned low and Hannah's hymn faded to silence, Kevin bowed his head. His massive shoulders trembled slightly as he whispered his first prayer in 20 years. "Lord," he said roughly, "thank you for mercy." Tears tracked down his cheeks, unashamed. Hannah reached across the space between their chairs and clasped his calloused hand. Her own eyes brimmed with joyful tears as she watched her husband's heart continue to soften. The firelight danced across the carved words above them, a testament to how love had transformed their lives. Together they sat in peaceful silence, two souls who had found belonging after decades of isolation. Their cabin stood as proof that it was never too late for redemption, never too late for love to heal old wounds. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.